So I better hurry up and do this quickly because the looks like the rain is coming. So I'm just going to do a quick intro to this next excerpt by Alexander Mercouris about the sanctions on Russia, particularly on the central bank, and also how it's going on the ground, the military invasion of Ukraine. And just before I start, I want to reiterate, as I've done before, that I'm not for any particular nation being number one on this planet, and I certainly am not for imperialism. I'm anti-imperialist, and I'm also anti-war, and I also am against countries invading other countries, although I understand why that has happened with Russia. And I'm not going to repeat those comments that I've made about that. You can watch the last two videos to see where I am in that regard. But I wanted to just briefly say about this commentary by Alexander Mercouris, and please note I do not endorse the Duran. It's a sort of a right-wing site, but Alexander Mercouris on his own channel by himself, it's actually usually a very good analysis of what's going on in Europe, China, Russia, etc. He usually gives very good analysis of that. So with that out of the way, I wanted to just give a brief rundown on what this is. It's basically about this. This looks like it could be NATO and the US. I mean, the US controls NATO. An attempt to detach Russia through regime change in Russia, detach it from China, and the constant saber rattling that NATO has done, and bringing everything up to Russia's borders, moving eastward when it said it wouldn't. The overthrowing in 2014 of Ukraine, the Ukrainian government, the coup, the US-backed coup. And all of that that's been happening, all the saber rattling, which has been tremendous against Russia, has resulted in Russia feeling threatened enough to do something very extreme and unfortunate, to say the least. But it is understandable that Russia is feeling this, basically the walls closing in. And really it seems like there are a number of people now globally who are thinking that this is possibly always planned, that it was engineered this way, so that Russia would make some kind of a move like this, or even just if it had stopped at the Donbass. Basically, they just needed any sort of excuse. The Western governments and also, basically all the capitalists, imperialists that exist, they just needed some excuse to do what they've done now, which is go beyond the sanctions that they have already, which were what would be considered severe, which is the most severe thing you can do, which is attack basically and sanction the central bank of a G20 country. That's probably the worst thing you could do to a country, and they are trying to economically destroy Russia. All the various countries in the world now see that there is no bridge too far for the US in basically, if you don't do what you're told, if you aren't playing ball with the US, if you look like you're a threat to their global dominance, you are a threat to global dominance of the US, and they will take measures that show that they cannot be trusted. And even the various Western large banks have been warning the Biden administration not to take this measure of basically attacking the Russian central bank. They've been sort of very against that and say it's going to have very negative outcomes. And the interesting thing is that it looks like this could end up being, if it does not bring down the Russian economy, which Alexander Mercouris thinks that it will not, and he explains why, and he has some good sources. And so that's an interesting. It's interesting. I'm going to play it all because it's interesting, and I can't. My commentary would be superfluous. There's a great unlikelihood that it's going to bring down the Russian economy, and it may make it very difficult. But what it is going to do is create further circumventing of this SWIFT system, and that'll be done by China, and China is a key ally. This whole thing is seen to be a way of detaching China from Russia, or detaching Russia from China, so because they've become such allies, and they are, China is going to be the great economic power in the world soon, and this is something the US capitalists cannot abide by. Capitalism is fine as long as you're monopolizing everything, and as long as you're calling the shots in the case of the US empire. So what this is going to do, this trying to destroy the Russian economy, and of course that affects people, and these sanctions are acts of war. They're acts of war against Venezuela, against Iran, and other countries. They're intended to destroy the economy and make people suffer. And in turn, hopefully, they're hoping that the people of that country will turn against the government. And then, of course, they can help do a coup and hopefully install a puppet that will do the bidding of the US empire. And it looks like this isn't going to work because they have Russia will have the assistance of China, and China is going to probably create a separate system to the SWIFT system. So that'll be a completely separate system to the Western banking in some way. Maybe not completely separate, but it'll give China and Russia more control of their own economies, and also any country that is much smaller, like Venezuela and other countries like that, they also will benefit from that. So it's basically creating a multipolar world in economic terms. Now, I might be, I hope that I'm presenting this correctly. Anyway, Alexander Mercouris can explain this much better than I can. And so, in fact, this attempt to do a coup of Russia, the government of Russia, by the US, is going to only strengthen China, basically. So the outcome is probably going to be the opposite. And that Russia has has about $700 million coming in every day from exports, and they're not going to touch those particular exports because that's going to make all sorts of problems for the rest of the world, not just Russia. It's going to make problems for everybody. This is the thing about globalization. You damage one group, and that will affect other groups, and they might cause incredible inflation through this disconnecting Russia from the SWIFT system, and then sanctioning the Russian central bank. This is probably going to have very negative repercussions for everybody on the planet. But it's also going to push Russia and China closer together, and they were already very close militarily and otherwise. It makes sense to be like that against an empire that wants to destroy you both. And it'll also strengthen China and its economy. So this is something that maybe in their hubris, in the US oligarchs and capitalists in their hubris, they didn't bank on this literally. They did not, they're so intent on the US becoming the number one and everybody else is subservient to them. They did not think that this may actually backfire. I mean, it's not rocket science to see that China and Russia have been becoming closer and closer. And I mean, it totally makes sense. That's what I would do if I was a country that was in the crosshairs of the US. I would be trying to make friends, particularly with all the different countries that are in the crosshairs, and that's any country that isn't doing the US's bidding, that isn't that wants to look after their people. That's a no-no in a neoliberal sense. So it's not rocket science to see that China has been they've been creating systems to try and make themselves more independent of the US, and so has Russia. They actually, before this even happened, they were separating themselves from their bank, in some ways from their financial system, and that makes sense because look at the US cannot be trusted. The Western banking system cannot be trusted because this is what they do. I mean, look at everybody. A lot of these Western countries and also associated countries are falling in line. India isn't falling in line. India knows that India's always been a long-term ally of Russia. And that's a huge country. So China and India are not against Russia, and neither is the UAE, surprisingly. So, there's two massive major countries who are... India is also going to probably support Russia economically as well. Basically, if Russia can survive this, which, it seems like they probably will, then that means they will be free in some ways of... this is probably the worst thing that the US can do, bar militarily invading or what would end up being mutually assured destruction in the world, basically nuking various cities in Russia and all of that, which would end up being a planetary annihilation and a nuclear winter. So unless we have complete demented, which I think there are some demented people in the Pentagon and elsewhere, Dr. Strangelove's, unless they want to go that route, it looks like this is probably the worst thing they can do. And now, as Alexander Mercouris said, if they can survive this, which they probably will, with the help of China and possibly India, they will be free in some ways. They won't have this, they won't be able to do that anymore. And that is something that the US is trying to do to many countries, basically cripple them with sanctions. Doing this to a central bank has never ever been done before. So this is like the worst thing that the US has ever done to a country in relation to sanctions. So anyway, that's kind of like what I gleaned from what Alexander Mercouris has said, and now I'm going to show you his he also talks about what's happening on the ground, which is, he says, is quite different from a lot of the propaganda that's going around about Ukraine and, the military side of things, even though he says he's not a military expert, but he says that things are, seem to be going along reasonably smoothly for Russia. And I'm not cheering that on or anything. As I said, I'm anti-war, I'm an anti-imperialist, I'm against any country invading another country. But as I said, I also understand why this has happened, and I blame NATO and the US empire for bringing this about. And I think as this will sort of demonstrate, it looks like it was an intentional engineering to detach Russia from China, the key ally, so that then they can just go for China. I don't know why they think that China's going to be some sort of a rollover if Russia is no longer around, but there you go with the hubris. I mean, it's the talk about sort of deluded. Anyway, so thanks for watching. Please stay tuned for this next bit, and I hope that Alexander Mercouris doesn't mind me playing this most of his segment, but I just thought, me commenting on it throughout would be sort of superfluous, and so I just decided to play the whole thing. So thanks for watching. Till next time, stay tuned.
Contrary to what is being reported across the West, the Russian military operation continues at a steady pace. More and more cities in eastern and central Ukraine are invested. The Russian military is gradually penetrating ever more deeply into Kiev, though it seems to be avoiding an all-out assault on the city. There's apparently been fighting in Kharkiv, which is Ukraine's second largest city, and it seems also that further east, the Ukrainian army that was fighting the Donbass is coming under increasing pressure and is gradually being surrounded. Now, that's his perspective of the war. I hope I've reproduced it accurately. I think I have. And as I said, it corresponds to the extent that it matters with my own. Now, the fact that it seems that the military operation, the Russian military operation, which is only a few days old, a fact which, again, I think many people perhaps are not aware of, the fact that this military operation is proceeding, shall we say, according to, well, I don't know what plan. As I said, the Russian General Staff doesn't share its plans with me, but certainly according to some kind of operational schedule, I presume. That may explain why the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian leadership, has done that which they seem to be extraordinarily unwilling to do, which is to sit down to talks with the Russians. And this has been a bizarre affair. Firstly, a couple of days ago, we had that extraordinarily bitter speech from President Zelensky, in which he said that the Western powers had completely let Ukraine down and left it alone when it faced the wrath of the Russians. And he spoke then about Ukraine's willingness to engage Russia in peace talks, with neutrality, the issue of neutrality being in the agenda. And then the Russian government responded by saying that they were open for such talks, and apparently discussions took place, and there was a preliminary agreement that the meeting should take place between the Russian and Ukrainian delegations in the Belarusian capital, Minsk. And then the Ukrainians turned round and said no, they were not prepared to meet in Minsk. They said this time that they were prepared, however, to meet in Warsaw. Warsaw being, of course, the capital of Poland, a NATO country friendly to Ukraine. Apparently the Russians agreed, but in the event, no discussions or meetings in Warsaw did take place. And I should say that I've read Twitter threads by people like Kevin Costola and others, which I cannot corroborate, but which essentially say that the reason the Ukrainians pulled out of the talks was because of pressure that they came under from the United States. I mentioned that. I'm not entirely clear why the Ukrainians should be listening to the Americans at this point, but doubtless there are divisions within the Ukrainian leadership, and it may very well be that some of the more hardline factions are acting on whatever encouragement the United States is giving them. Anyway, it seems, I'm basing this entirely on this information that I've read on Twitter, which may not be, I should stress, fully reliable. It may be that it was the United States that persuaded the Ukrainians to call the talks off. Anyway, the result was that the Russians resumed their operations. The latest information that I've had, it comes, as I said, from Gonzalo Lira, but it tends to be confirmed by other sources, is that following this resumption of the Russian offensive, the tempo of operations rapidly accelerated, and it seems that more Ukrainian territory was lost. The Russian army has penetrated more deeply into Kiev, and the Ukrainian army in eastern Ukraine has come closer to being encircled. So the sequel was apparently a telephone call between President Zelensky of Ukraine and Prime Minister Bennett of Israel, in which Zelensky asked the Israelis to mediate, and I'm not quite sure what that eventually led to, but then there were further discussions apparently between Zelensky and President Lukashenko of Belarus, and it was agreed that the talks would now take place in Belarus as had been previously agreed. Then there was further discussions and further announcements from Ukraine saying that they would not talk in Belarus under any circumstances, apparently in any part of Belarus. Apparently there were then agreements that there would be talks and that these would be in the western Belarusian city of Gomel, which is near the border with Ukraine. And after much prevarication and doubt, after the Russian delegation led by a senior Russian official, Leonid Slutsky, arrived, and after the Russian deadline for the Ukrainian delegation to show up had actually expired, news finally came through that the Ukrainian delegation is indeed in Belarus and that talks in Gomel are indeed going to begin. Now, this is all extremely confusing, but it does give an idea of the difficulties the Ukrainians are having negotiating with the Russians and about the uncertainties that they have about their position. I'm going to add one further point at this stage, which is to say that there's been certain commentaries in the Chinese media which suggest that China, which has been coming out quite strongly over the last few days in opposition to the West sanctions policy, I'm going to come to that shortly, and which has shown consistent support and sympathy for the Russian position, but China, which therefore has good relations with Russia, but which has also maintained a fairly good relationship with Ukraine, is now positioning itself as a potential mediator. I would say that this is far from certain that this is going to happen, and I would have thought that if China were to set itself up as a mediator, if it were to assume a mediation role between the Russians and the Ukrainians, then the United States would be extremely unhappy, and there might even be discussion in Washington about this whole affair turning into a debacle. Anyway, that seems to me the situation on the ground at the moment. Negotiations in Gomel, we don't know where they're going to go. The Ukrainians seem to be very uncertain, but they're clearly feeling the pressure. They weren't apparently very willing to negotiate, but now they've decided to turn up and negotiate after all. A gathering tempo of offensive operations by the Russian military, and China perhaps starting to maneuver towards taking a mediation role. All of that is going on the ground. But in the West, what we now have is what you might call an attempt to engage Russia in financial shock and awe. Up to now, up to yesterday, the sanctions which had been announced against Russia were, to put it mildly, ineffectual. But yesterday was different. And yesterday, the United States and its European allies, the EU and various other EU states, as well as Canada, and eventually, apparently after some uncertainty and self-doubt, Japan, they finally decided to do the thing which I suspect the Americans have been thinking about doing all along. When I say the Americans, I want to stress the Biden administration, which is firstly, they did put some Russian banks. We're not quite sure which ones, but the Germans have said it's the same Russian banks which have already been sanctioned. They are going to put some Russian banks, they're then going to disconnect them from SWIFT, the interbank messaging service. And they have also said, and this is perhaps the most dramatic development of all, that they're putting the sanctions on Russia's central bank. Now, these sanctions are going to take two forms. Firstly, they're going to prevent Western banks and financial institutions from having dealings with the Russian central bank. And secondly, the Europeans say that they're going to freeze any central bank assets, in other words, any financial reserves that the central bank may have in the territory of the European Union. Now, I'm not sure how much that is, or indeed whether the Russian central bank has any reserves in the European Union. But in any event, this is a massive escalation. And the United States has openly said what the purpose is. There's going to be a speculative attack on the ruble on Monday, which is to say tomorrow. That's going to drive the ruble down. And because of these sanctions, the Russian central bank will not be able to intervene in the foreign currency markets to support the ruble. At which point the idea is that the ruble will crash. That will supposedly cause inflation in Russia to skyrocket, and that in turn will undoubtedly or supposedly put pressure on the Russian government. Now, I am going to make one important observation about this. At various times over the course of the sanctions discussions, there have been reports in parts of the media, the American media, that President Biden himself and his administration did not want to take steps which might make life more difficult for ordinary Russians. Well, these sanctions that have just been announced prove that false. The sanctions that have been announced, if they are indeed intended to create an inflation crisis in Russia, are directly targeted at ordinary Russians. It is their living standards that are now coming under direct assault. Moreover, this is being done together with a massive campaign in the British and American media, which makes it quite clear that the intention of these sanctions is to turn the Russian population against their government, and in order essentially to force President Putin out of power, in effect to achieve regime change in Russia. So we are back to the classic sanctions policy of using the West's financial firepower, financial shock and awe, to try to engineer the collapse of the government that the United States and the Western powers are targeting. Now, I am going to say a few things about this. Firstly, I have no way of knowing whether or not this is true, but I suspect that there are people in Moscow, and not just in Moscow, but in other world capitals, who must be asking themselves today whether this has been the agenda all along. Chinese media commentary, for example, has been consistently saying that it is the United States that has engineered this conflict in Ukraine. And given that that is what the Chinese appear to believe, I suspect that the Chinese believe that this is indeed an attack, an attempt by the United States, set up by the United States, to engineer regime change in Moscow in order to detach from China its key ally, which of course is Russia. So that, I think, is a view that you're going to find in many places, and I'm pretty sure it is the view in Beijing. That's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that the policy almost certainly will fail. I say that based on experience. The United States has tried this so many times against so many countries. I cannot remember one case where this policy has on its own terms succeeded. It's been attempted against Iraq when Saddam Hussein was the leader of the country. It's been attempted against Venezuela, against Cuba, against North Korea. Perhaps more appropriately, it's been attempted against Iran. All the same types of sanctions that we've been hearing about have been tried out against Iran, and yet Iran still has the same government it has always had. Moreover, there is one critical difference in the sanctions that the United States has imposed on Russia and on the sanctions that the United States has imposed on Iran, because the United States has taken no step to interfere with or obstruct Russian energy, metals and agricultural exports. As US officials have admitted, those are too important to the stability of the world economy to be interfered with. Russia is too big a player in world commodities to be pushed out without this causing a critical crisis across the world economy, the global economy. So that means that the Russians, unlike the Iranians, will continue to receive a steady cash flow, a flow of money that will continue to be paid to them in return for their oil, their gas, their wheat, their metals, and all the various other products which they sell internationally. And if you burrow down hard into the sanctions announcement, if you look at the details, you will see that the payment systems, the SWIFT payment system, the restrictions on the SWIFT payment system that have been imposed with respect to Russia still allow for payment of money to Russia in return via SWIFT, in return for the Russians continuing to sell their products overseas. And that already, it seems to me, undermines the rationale of this move. Because if the Russians continue, as they no doubt will, to run a large trade surplus, it's not obvious why there should be any real pressure on the ruble at all. After all, a country which runs a big trade surplus, which is self-sufficient, ought in theory to have a strong currency rather than a weak one. I say this, I appreciate, with some irony, because of course the ruble has fluctuated considerably, to put it mildly, over the last 10 years. But logically, a country that runs a large trade surplus and which has very little debt should not really need to interfere to support its currency to any great degree, because that currency ought in theory to be already strong. Moreover, since as a result of all these financial moves, the prices of commodities are almost certainly going to rise, that means that there will be an increase, a strengthening of Russia's trade surplus, which ought logically to strengthen the ruble even further. In fact, if one looks at the situation over the last few years, going back roughly to, I think, 2016, there's not actually been any significant central bank action by the Russian central bank to support the ruble. The central bank has been quite happy up to now to let the ruble simply float. And though there was allegedly a minor intervention last week, at the start of last week, when the first tranche of sanctions was announced, it's apparently on a very small scale, and it didn't really impact on the central bank's reserves to any significant degree. So logically, the Russian central bank should not be needing at this time, at a time when Russia's export trade is unaffected and when it continues to receive very large receipts, very large sums of money, $700 million a day apparently, in return for its exports. The Russian central bank should not really be needing to interfere to any very great extent on the world currency markets in order to support the ruble. Now, of course, that's the theory. The practice, the reality, is that markets are rarely moved by logic, at least not initially. They're moved by sentiment. And further than this, there are ways, as I know, of manipulating currencies. I'm not going to get into the technical details because, to be straightforward about this, as I'm not a forex trader or indeed any kind of trader, I don't really understand them. But I understand that it is in fact possible to involve oneself in the foreign currency markets in a way to push down the value of a currency. So when the markets open on Monday, I fully expect the ruble to crash. I'm sure it's going to fall and fall very far. However, there are 2 points about this which need to be made. Firstly, further down the ruble goes, the more valuable in ruble terms the export earnings that Russia makes from its sales of oil, gas, food, paid for in dollars and euros and those sort of currencies, the greater that amount of money, the more rubles that actually buys internally within Russia itself. So one can actually start to see how this could end up in some ways strengthening Russia's budget position. I merely mentioned that. I mean, the big Russian export companies, the companies that sell oil and gas, will still, it seems, be able to convert their foreign currency holdings into rubles. They will be able to pay their money to the Russian government, or so as I understand it. I'm not sure how that can be prevented within Russia itself. And at that point, it seems to me that the Russian budget will not only hold up, but given that commodity prices are growing, will probably move into higher surplus. So that's the first thing. But the second thing is that it's also perhaps worth saying that just as the Russian government isn't realistically going to run out of money as a result of this operation, so it seems to me it will make it easier for the Russian authorities to contain this problem. Now, I've talked about the way in which the ruble is going to crash. People who hold rubles are going to try and sell them and convert them obviously into dollars so that they can get out of the ruble as fast as possible because of the speculative attack that it's going to come under. But who are these people? Well, firstly, it's not going to be the general Russian population. Many Russians do, as it happens, want to hold foreign currency. But at the end of the day, they live in Russia, and things that they buy in Russia are bought in rubles. So they have to have rubles. And it's most unlikely that most of them will want to increase their dollar euro holdings to any significant degree, because realistically, especially now that travel restrictions are piling up on them, they can't realistically travel. So it's not going to be the general population. The kind of people who hold dollars and euros in the necessary quantities to make a difference, or at least who might be prepared to sell rubles and buy dollars and do this in large numbers, are going to be the business community, are going to be big Russian corporates, they're going to be oligarchs, they're going to be currency traders in the Russian financial markets, people based in Moscow. And of course, since they are in Moscow, that means that the Russian authorities can influence what they do, especially as, I suspect, there are not many of them to start with. I mean, I'm not saying that they're in insignificant number, but Russian currency markets are very small. We're not here looking at currency markets like those for the dollar, the euro, the Swiss franc, the pound sterling. This is a lightly traded currency. So I would have thought that after a couple of probably rather wild weeks, the situation is going to stabilise anyway. I would be surprised personally if this goes on indefinitely. Eventually, this process will unwind and reach its conclusion. And though there may indeed be higher inflation as a result, as the ruble falls and the cost of importing goods from overseas rises, this may not be quite the dramatic event that people in the West imagine. Not for the first time, I suspect that Western leaders think that what they're doing is going to have a devastating effect on an economy which they don't really understand very well. I suspect they still think that it is more like, at least in currency trades, like their own, when of course the Russian economy is profoundly different. And I'm going to say something else. If we're talking about Russian imports, and nowadays the major imports that Russia imports are the raw materials that result in the production of consumer goods or consumer goods themselves, there's been a steady shift away in imports of consumer goods. Once upon a time, 10, 50 years ago, Russia imported consumer goods from the West, or the products to make those consumer goods from the West. Today, that trade has diversified. So, for example, Russia today imports cotton from Uzbekistan, which goes into the Russian textile industry. It imports smartphones from China. It imports things from all sorts of other places where it's not going to be paying, or perhaps it will be in a much better position to pay for these goods in other currencies outside the Western financial system. Now, I say all of that because, of course, this exercise in financial shock and awe can only work if it works quickly. It has to achieve results, I mean dramatic results, I mean regime change, within a couple of months, a year at most. Because thereafter, the situation will not just stabilise, it will transform, it will change in a way in which the economy, the Russian economy, finds equilibrium, and in which it starts to forge further financial and economic links with other powers, China obviously being the overriding one, but India also being quite probably another, at which point not only will this operation have failed and visibly failed, but more important, the global financial system will have fractured. And this is where I come back to my last point, because it's now, I think, widely accepted. Gonzalo Riva, who has information on this from within the United States, which he tells me is completely reliable, but I've also seen this confirmed in Bloomberg and Reuters. The Federal Reserve Board apparently advised the administration not to take this step, and so did the big Wall Street banks, and so did the European banks. The European banks advised the European Commission that this would be a dangerous step to take. It would undermine the integrity of the SWIFT system. It would accelerate moves towards creating an alternative financial architecture, with Russia so central to the global trade in commodities. The Russians would anyway be in a strong position to start exerting pressure on their customers to start linking up to the Russian financial system in order to receive the kind of goods, the essential goods that Russia provides. So the Western financial community is not happy with this decision. They feel that it undermines its integrity, it undermines its unity, it risks creating an alternative to the Western financial system, which it would have been most unwise for the West to do. But there is something else to this, and it's a point which perhaps has not been discussed adequately, and that is that the effect of this move around the world is going to be absolutely resounding. Over the last few years, over the last 10 years, the United States has become increasingly reckless in its sanctions policies, and especially in its targeting of central banks. It's already sanctioned central banks in Iran, in Venezuela, in Cuba, and of course in North Korea. The sanctioning of Iran was a big step, which is extremely alarming for many countries. Now, Russia, a far bigger economy, far more diversified, far more important economy than Iran, has seen its central bank targeted as well. This is a G20 economy. It's the economy of one of the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. Countries around the world are going to be saying to themselves, how can we be sure that one day the United States is not going to come after us in the same way? And the decision of the European Commission to try to freeze whatever financial reserves the Russian central bank holds in Europe, that's going to alarm other countries even further. It comes just weeks after that extraordinary decision taken by the Biden administration, first to freeze and then to confiscate the reserves held in the Afghan central bank. It's become crystal clear now to everyone around the world that what calls itself the global financial system is in reality no such thing. It is instead a financial system run by the United States, the European Union, and Britain to some extent. In other words, by a small group of countries that have decided that they are the ones that will arbitrate what can and cannot be done around the world. And more countries seeing this are going to start looking to protect themselves after this particular move. Now, in the past, this was not perhaps something which would have concerned the Americans too much. After all, there were no realistic rivals to the Western-led financial system until very recently. But China today has an economy which in purchasing power parity terms is actually bigger than the United States, which has financial firepower greater than the United States. I've recently read a study which shows that the biggest lender internationally today is no longer the United States and the West, it is actually China. And given that this is so, it seems to me like that just as so much else, what the United States is doing is playing directly into China's hands. It is consolidating the belief around the world that China is a more reliable guardian of people's money than the United States itself is. It breaks the rules when it comes to central banks. It imposes sanctions, which there is a very good juridical argument it doesn't actually have the legal authority to do. These sanctions, after all, have not been authorized by the United Nations Security Council. It seizes funds held in central bank reserves. It seizes funds held in sovereign wealth funds, as it's shown it's willing to do in the past. So why trust the financial institutions controlled by the West? And there's been something else as well, because one of the interesting facts that came to light, at least for me, though like I think pretty much everybody, I'd already guessed it. But one of the interesting facts that has now been confirmed from the various discussions that have taken place about the SWIFT disconnection is that big Western banks have warned the administration that disconnecting Russia from SWIFT, especially if it results in the creation of alternative messaging, interbank messaging systems, means that the United States is going to lose track of financial flows. In other words, up till now, the United States has been kept informed of where money is flowing because of the messaging that has been going on through SWIFT, with the implication being that that messaging is shared with the United States and with the European authorities, something, by the way, which I personally have never doubted. Now, that's not going to be possible. Obviously, there's already been a certain degree of activity which the United States hasn't been able to monitor, which has been taking place through cryptocurrencies. But now we're going to see national currencies being moved around in all kinds of ways through alternative systems, which the United States can't keep track on. And this, of course, as both China and Russia prepare to launch their own digital currencies, which won't need messaging systems at all. So to take this step now seems to me unwise, reckless, based upon a misunderstanding of how things work in the world, based on a misunderstanding of how the Russian economy works. Well, there we are. They've done it. Having done it once, they can't take it back. Even if they were to reverse that decision, they will find it extremely difficult to erase the impression of what that they have given as a result of what they have done. In fact, I would say it is impossible. So I would say that this step that's been made, in some ways, is more consequential than the war in Ukraine itself. I say that, I understand that people are dying in the war in Ukraine, but if I'm going to tell a bitter and awful truth, wars are commonplace. The event which we've just seen, the sanctioning of a G20 central bank, is unprecedented. And as of now, the world has changed forever. I'm going to finish with one final point, which is about Russia. The first thing to say is that the Russians, I'm confident, will be able to get through this, and I'm fairly certain that if they do run into serious problems, which they may do, the Chinese will come to their rescue. That's my own personal view. I hold to it quite firmly. We will see how things turn out. I will say that I think the Russians have been aware of this possibility. It explains it's one reason, surely, why they've been busy piling up their gold reserves for so long and keeping, of course, those gold reserves in Russia itself. But I have to say that despite this, despite the fact that they might have been intellectually prepared for this, I think they must still be at some level shocked by it. But in any event, shock wears off. I think they will find their way through. They've found their way through bigger problems. I'm confident they will be able to do that this time. If they do, and I believe they will, then they will be free. Because some time ago, a US official, probably Jake Sullivan, said that the United States is going to go to the very top of the escalatory ladder. And this is the very top of the escalatory ladder. There is nothing more that the United States can now do that goes above what the United States has now done. There is no step which can be taken which goes beyond sanctioning a central bank. So if the Russians can survive this, then there is nothing more that the United States can do to them. At that point, they are free. And I believe that they will be. So at that point, perhaps things will start to change even more radically between Russia and the West. So an earth-shaking event, an extraordinary event, an event which, as I said, is unprecedented in the period of the post-war, since the Second World War, though one which has been signalled by smaller steps that the United States has been taking over the last 10-15 years. We shall see where this ends. We shall see how this ends.